again, everyone. If you've just joined us in the last couple of minutes, we're just giving attendees a minute or two to come into the room before we begin this webinar. And we're really looking forward to talking to you all in this new format. It's entirely new for us, so please bear with us if there's a few hiccups as we get used to conducting our panel session in this kind of space. Ordinarily, we're obviously used to doing this face-to-face, but of course we now live in a world of Zoom where we are beginning to conduct more and more of these matters online. So I'm actually going to just begin very briefly now with some preliminaries. And the first one is one very important one, which is I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this webinar meets and their custodianship of this land, and pay my respect to their ancestors and their descendants before going forwards. I'm Associate Professor Sarah Percy, and I'm Deputy Head of the School of Politics and International Studies at the University of Queensland. And we're very excited to have this webinar today to discuss COVID-19 and the reshaping of global politics. In this School of Politics and International Studies at UQ, we study all kinds of political issues at the local level, at the national level, and at the global level. We're really interested in the big problems the world faces. We're interested in thinking about the main challenges which are on the political agenda and how we're meeting these challenges. We think even about how solutions to the challenges in the past have worked, how solutions to similar challenges have worked. In other words, our core business is thinking exactly about the sorts of issues that are facing the world as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're thinking about these issues in terms of their impact for society, for Australia, and for international politics. Before we turn to our panelists, I just want to remind you all again that this is a new format for us, and we may have a few challenges as we go along. I hope not. Our plan is to conduct this as a panel discussion with me moderating a chat between our three illustrious panelists. And then after about 40 minutes of chat, we'll turn it over to the Q&A. So if you have a question, you can type that in the Q&A and I will relay it to the panelists. And then hopefully we can get a bit of interaction going that way. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you very briefly to our panelists. We have Associate Professor Shahar Mary, who's a political economist who specializes in the politics of security and development in Asia and the Pacific. Associate Professor Andrew Phillips, who studies the collapse of international orders. And Dr. Sarah Teat, who studies China and the politics of genocide, mass atrocities prevention, and peace building. So I'm going to turn now to get my panelists to do work for the evening and answer some difficult questions about COVID-19. There's no doubt that COVID-19 has created a health crisis, and in some parts of the world, this health crisis might be playing into a political crisis. The most obvious place we can see the impact of COVID-19 outside health is in the economy, and I think that's where I'd like to start. So COVID-19 has precipitated the deepest global economic crisis since the Great Depression. Shahar, can you tell us how that global economic crisis is reshaping the global economy?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and hi everyone out there. I wish I was able to actually see you. Thanks for joining us this evening. The word unprecedented has had an unprecedented rate of use over the last few weeks. I actually saw a graph recently that showed it has spiked almost as fast as cases of COVID-19 around the world. Now, the term unprecedented is entirely appropriate when we come to talk about what's happening to the global economy. Sarah mentioned previously that what we're seeing at the moment is the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression of the late 1920s, early 1930s. But in fact, in many ways, it is an even starker economic crisis than we saw back then. The rate of collapse in output, in demand, the spike in unemployment in countries around the world, the collapse of international trade, investment, all of these have happened incredibly quickly, whereas in the Great Depression, it took quite a long time to get there. So I think if we're trying to think about what is happening at the moment, probably the main point we can start from is the notion that globalization, economic globalization, which has been probably the most significant aspect of the global economy since the 1970s, has either stalled or even perhaps gone into reverse. And there are two aspects that I'd like to focus on in particular. The first is that of the undoing of what you may call global value chains, which essentially is a fancy word for talking about the production of goods or services across borders. That has been a core feature of economic globalization. In fact, recently it was estimated that about 70% of all trade is linked to those kinds of global value chains that are usually controlled by a multinational corporation. So these global value chains have been coming undone because of the COVID-19 crisis, especially in critical supplies, for instance, medical supplies, which we've all seen, medicine and so on. But the roots of that go a little bit earlier than the COVID-19 crisis, because many of the issues we're dealing with now have not actually emerged with this crisis, but have perhaps been intensified by it. So if we go back a few years to the global financial crisis of the late noughties, we can see that some of these dynamics began then. We're actually intensifying with the rise of China, its own attempt to escape the middle income trap, the United States concerned about its own loss of position within the, if you like, the global pyramid within those global supply chains, and attempt to retain that by weaponizing its central position in the global economy. All of those things have already led to some kind of a weakening of these structures before the current crisis. And then there is the issue of the dollar, which remains, if you like, central to the global economy, even as other aspects of globalization have weakened. And in fact, what we're seeing at the moment is this very significant disjuncture between collapse in the, if you like, real economy of production and consumption, but alongside that, quite a remarkable rally in global markets that is facilitated by the release of liquidity by the American Federal Reserve in particular, and it's spread around the world. So we live in a bit of a complicated period where some aspects of globalization remain very central to what is going on, but others seem to be coming under some kind of strain.
So thinking from the global and moving more towards the local, what do you think the implications of the global economic crisis are, particularly for domestic politics in liberal democracies like Australia?
That is the big question that we're all trying to understand. I think that the consensus that we've had for a long time, that economic development, economic growth would rely on liberal markets, I think that has collapsed to some extent. But perhaps most ironically, the attack on free markets is coming from the right rather than from the left. We always believe that if neoliberalism is going to be undone, it's going to be, or maybe some people believe it's going to come from the left. Well, it is actually most around the world, mostly conservative governments that are pumping enormous amounts of money in order to sustain national economies. The question is what's going to happen next? Is this going to be just a temporary spike, and then the concern with debt and I guess ensuring the significant interest within the economy remain paramount, continues to dominate the economic agenda, or are we going to see these kinds of deep intervention and public spending become a constant feature of our economy, and we are going to move into a very different economic world than we've come to know? We can't really say at this point. Governments are talking about unwinding these public spending programs, especially the Australian government has been saying that, but reality may force them to maintain these spending programs into the indefinite future, but that would require them to also change their understanding of how the economy works.
So, Shahar, you mentioned that the word unprecedented is experiencing unprecedented usage. And before this crisis took off, I suspect the other unprecedented spike in word usage related to the global international order, or the liberal international order, which is a concept which didn't even really exist in the lexicon 5 or 6 years ago and has suddenly become everything that we're talking about. So given how much we talk about the global international order, and by that we mean the rules and institutions internationally that help governments work together and solve common problems, what's COVID-19 revealed about that international order, Andrew?
Well, I'd like to say that as someone who studies the collapse of international orders, this is really a great time to be alive. We're witnessing the catastrophic unraveling of international order.
And that's the optimistic note for the evening, everyone.
And I'm going to be setting that optimistic tone throughout the remainder of the discussion. I think the first thing, as you noted, is to figure out what is it exactly that we mean by international order, and particularly the idea of a liberal international order. And really, the liberal international order is based on a series of ideas that we can best promote peace and prosperity through three things. The first of those is the promotion of democracy globally. The second is the idea of cultivating global prosperity through globalization conceived generally in liberal terms. That is, if you leave it to the market, that will be the best way of producing both prosperity and also peace as a side dividend of that. And the third is this idea that no matter how interdependent we become, no matter how vulnerable we become as a result of those interdependencies, that we'll be able to rely upon international institutions and multilateral fora in order to coordinate and address those problems. And truth be told, as you've noted, typically you don't know what you've got till it's gone. People have been talking about the liberal international order for the last decade because there's an increasing perception that each of those pillars are beginning to become fragile. So even before COVID-19, we had a sense that there was democratic deconsolidation, so the rise of populist movements throughout the world, even in the established Western liberal democracies. There was also a sense that liberal economic interdependence had a decided downside, which has been very clearly dramatised by the kind of things that Shahar was just telling us about. But I think what COVID-19 has really done is decisively accelerate scepticism around those promises, but I think illuminate most particularly the vulnerabilities and, it has to be said, manifest inadequacies of existing multilateral fora to address global problems. If we think of something like the pandemic, it has come as a huge shock to us, but it is worth noting that COVID-19 is the fourth pandemic that we have experienced since 2000. We've had SARS, we've had MERS, both of which were extraordinarily serious and perceived to be serious much more acutely in East Asia than elsewhere. We've also had the Ebola crisis, which killed a slightly larger number of people. And I think the fact that the Obama administration, for example, had a pandemic preparedness task force is an indication that there was some awareness that this was a system-wide problem that might crystallise. I think in response to what this tells us about the international order, I think probably two observations that are trite, but nevertheless true. The first is that COVID-19 has dramatised the fragility and inadequacy of existing institutional mechanisms for dealing with this as a threat. I mean, the fact that you have the World Health Organization responsible for trying to address global public health problems, and it's got a budget of less than $5 billion, I think is an indication of how under-resourced these kinds of systems to protect us are. The second, and this is a point that we may potentially return to in the discussion, is the degree to which domestic and international orders have become deeply and in some ways threateningly intertwined. Best illustrations of this are the fact that the Chinese government has been extraordinarily opaque in its original management of this crisis, helped to contribute to a global disaster. The fact that the United States has such a precarious public health system also helped to radically amplify it. And I think what that illustrates is that we may not be overlapping communities of fate in any deep cosmopolitan sense, but certainly vulnerabilities in domestic political orders are now having globally deleterious consequences.
So, Shahar, would you like to come in on that? A lot of people think that the obvious institution to blame, if we have to blame anyone in relation to the spread of the global pandemic, is the World Health Organization. Do you think that's fair?
I think it's unfair to the extent that, as Andrew said, the WHO was never actually given the capacity, both in terms of resourcing, but also in terms of support from its member states in order to be able to carry out that role satisfactorily. Its budget has been very small, but what Andrew did not say before is that out of those $5 billion, only $1 billion was actually its own budget. Everything else was tied to different projects. In 2013, for instance, the WHO cut its budget for it might sound a bit silly now, but from its budget for outbreak and crisis response by half, from about $400 million to about $200 million, saying that it had to do that because its budget was spread too thin, and then in order to be able to carry out its role should there be additional outbreaks, it would then go back to the member states and ask for more money. Now, the problem is actually that up until the COVID-19 outbreak at the moment, the underlying assumption of global governance when it comes to infectious disease was that those diseases are likely to emerge in relatively poor countries that are going to be subject to surveillance and an intervention away from the richer countries that are funding these operations, and then prevent contagion from actually arriving back at the shores of those countries. The problem with that is that, as long as that was the case, it sort of worked, although not necessarily to the best interest of the people living in the countries where the outbreaks actually took place. But what we've seen with COVID-19 was the contagion emerge in China, which is a very significant state within the UN system. The WHO, which has long been accustomed to go cap in hand to member states in order to ask for money, as I just mentioned, and this goes back to the 1970s, would not go overtly against one of those very important countries that could provide its bread and butter in the future. It could have been the United States, it could have been another country, it just happened to be China in this case. And therefore, the contagion from China was able to spread very quickly to those countries in Europe and North America. And at that point, all semblance of international collaboration was lost because they're all fighting contagion on the home front. They would not fund the WHO to run its offshore operations and do some of that themselves. They had to fight at home. So unfortunately, that is what happened at that point. So if you go back to the underlying question, is it the WHO's fault? Well, to an extent, yes, because it didn't do its job, but at the same time, it was never actually set up and resourced properly to do its job.
So given that we've had a WHO which has never been set up properly to do its job, and we've experienced a global pandemic, which is in part because of the failings of this organization, does this mean that COVID-19 is good news or bad news for the global governance of health in the future?
Is that the question? Is that
yeah?
Okay, thanks. I don't think it's good news because what we're seeing at the moment is largely recrimination, especially between the United States and China. Trump today called the WHO the puppet of China, which I don't think is correct. I don't think there's evidence to suggest that that is the case. It is a weak organization that is largely subservient to the interests of its important member states, but I wouldn't call it a Chinese puppet. I think that is unfair. There are also talks at the moment about maybe finding an alternative platform for intervening in infectious disease. It's basically a kind of free-for-all at the moment. So this current WHA, this World Health Assembly meeting that is happening as we speak, could be a pretty important one for the future of the WHO. But I can't see a situation where suddenly, unfortunately, I'm saying this, I can't see a situation where suddenly member states are going to properly fund an international body to do this work. I just don't think that's where we are at the moment.
Thanks, Shahar. So if you're just joining us, welcome to our Pulses webinar on the implications of COVID-19. And we have Shahar Hamiri, Andrew Phillips, and Sarah T here. For those of you who have burning questions, you can put them in the Q&A, but just so you know, we'll be answering those questions at the end of the panel discussion. And I will try and relay your questions to the panelists. So we've talked a lot, and Shahar is taking us through really nicely, Shahar and Andrew have taken us through really nicely, the public health impacts of COVID-19 and the impact on global governance and some of the economic impacts. But this isn't just a global health problem anymore, and it's not just something with global economic impact. Where else, Sarah T, can you tell us where else we see the impact of COVID-19?
Yeah, sure. I think that beyond, or perhaps linked to the health and economic crisis, we're also seeing a significant humanitarian impact and seeing how COVID-19 poses potential threats to peace and security, particularly in conflict-affected states. And this is, as Western donors have been preoccupied with outbreaks in their own countries, there's been concerns about the reduction in assistance to societies and people that are least able to deal with a pandemic. These are countries affected by conflict and disasters with weakened health systems, less resilience to economic shocks, and who are host to or home to large mobile and displaced populations. So there's a direct impact of the disease, but there's also an indirect impact around border closures, and as Shahar was talking about earlier, logistic supply disruptions. So humanitarian organizations have suspended relief programs in some countries due to international restrictions and some government restrictions, and we're seeing the shortage of international flights, rise in shipping costs, coronavirus lockdowns, creating massive backlogs, for example, in vaccine shipments. And so as the world is paying all this attention to this race for the COVID-19 vaccination, we're seeing less attention on the effect that COVID-19 restrictions are having on already well-established vaccination programs. UNICEF, for example, the UN Children's Fund that's responsible for providing humanitarian development aid to children worldwide, talks about, has said that they have about a 70 to 80% reduction in their vaccination shipments from last year. 2.4 billion vaccinations to 100 countries last year, 70 to 80% reduction as of March of this year. There are already reports of the impacts that the suspension of global vaccination programs has had. The UN has, for example, reported that in Afghanistan, they're seeing polio infections in provinces that haven't seen cases for decades. Other infectious diseases such as measles and cholera are also on the rise as a result of coronavirus restrictions. Mexico has already seen a measles outbreak this year, but that's in addition to really large-scale measles outbreaks in some conflict-affected countries last year, like Democratic Republic of Congo and Central African Republic, where the suspension of the programs to address the crises that they were facing last year have had a huge impact on the humanitarian situation in those countries. In addition to this, the World Food Program has warned that the number of acutely hungry people worldwide is going to nearly double this year, from about 135 million people last year to 265 million people this year. Similarly, we see the UN Population Fund, which deals with sexual and reproductive health, warning that the funding that is being mobilized for COVID-19 has to come from somewhere, and some of the places that's coming from is the funding for sexual and reproductive health. They're warning worldwide that it could fuel a rise in pregnancy complications, maternal deaths, and unsafe abortions. And we're seeing this already in some displaced and refugee communities. In Bangladesh in particular, which is host to just under 1 million Rohingya refugees who have fled genocidal violence in Myanmar. The government has asked aid groups not to bring in new staff, to limit travel between camps, and one of the first documented impacts of that was a rise in sexual and gender-based violence in those camps, and particularly intimate partner violence. And I work on the prevention of genocide and mass atrocities, and particularly a gender focus in that, and we know from this research that the rise in violence against women and girls, and particularly acute failures to protect the physical integrity rights of women and girls, is linked to wider patterns of violence in societies, particularly those that already have a high level of risk for genocide and mass atrocities. What they tell us is that the protection and the rights of women and girls is related to peaceful societies. Inversely, direct targeting against them is a sign of perhaps a risk factor for wider violence. And so this raises concerns that if all of the gender analysis to COVID-19 is pointing to a rise in violence against women and girls, that we see some unsettling factors there, not just for the human rights of those people, but also for wider patterns of violence in society. And COVID-19 is also linked to a rise in hate speech and incitement, and we see that in this region in particular, targeted against refugee communities and displaced communities. There's been attention in this for the Rohingya community in Malaysia in particular. But if I just want to go back for a second and reflect on sort of the key theme of this seminar, when it comes to thinking about this in the reshaping of global politics, Andrew mentioned the international order, but one aspect of that international order, or a subset of that, is the international humanitarian order. It's the complex of norms, institutions, laws, discourses that facilitate or even compel life-saving actions for people who are threatened by armed conflict, state violence, natural disasters, or other forms of complex emergencies. And a key feature of the national response to COVID-19 is that governments are reacting primarily to protect their own societies. A rise in xenophobia, a reduction in humanitarian aid, the denial of duties to assist non-citizens. Now, I don't want to overstate this as a new problem, but COVID-19 has brought the challenges to international humanitarian action into starker relief. When we see some of the states that have been the strongest supporters of humanitarian action turning inward, cutting aid, and in some cases outspokenly denying the obligations that they bear to anyone other than their own citizens, we can think about the broader challenges that COVID-19 has to the norms and institutions of the international humanitarian order.
Now this is, you can see how this is a virus which extends its fingers, as it were, into a huge number of different political and different types of political order, from the humanitarian order to conventional political orders. And I think that's part of the reason why it's very important for us to remember that pandemics are political problems in as much as they are public health problems. It's hard to see that there would be very many other problems in the world which would have as much political extent as a pandemic, because it cuts across so many different types of issues. So we've talked a lot about the public health, and Sarah, you've really well introduced us to the ideas that there are other types of international order and there are unseen and other political situations. But if we turn to some of what some people think is the traditional business of international relations, which is thinking about great powers and what they do we think COVID-19 has going to be have an interesting impact on the actions of the great powers, and in particular, the impact it's had on China? I wonder, Sarah, if you wanted to answer that first, and then we'll turn to Andrew.
Look, I think that, there's been a lot of speculation about COVID-19 and China's position in the world. And I think it's a mixed record. In one sense, we see China having established that it has an incredible capacity to mobilize resources and the power of the state to control, for crisis management, to control the spread of the virus, but it's much less good at prevention. And I just think, looking back I think Andrew might have mentioned the Sars outbreak of 2003, that China's health officials built an infectious disease reporting system that was hailed as one of the world's best disease early warning systems. And it was designed to evade political meddling, the same problems that they had in 2003. And what they, even as late as March of last year, Gao Fu, the director of China's Center for Disease Control and Prevention, told reporters, and this is hindsight is 2020, that a future epidemic on the scale of SARS would never happen again because China had this robust system. But now we've seen that this system that was built to protect medical expertise and infection reports from political tampering succumbed to political tampering. Hospitals deferred to health authorities about reporting infections. We see doctors who acted as whistleblowers discredited for spreading false rumors, Chinese journalists being censored. And what we see there is the fairly rigid bureaucratic and political hierarchy has been a real problem for crisis prevention. And that leaves us with the question of, when we think about sort of maybe the soft power gains that China has had for its incredible ability to contain the virus, there's been also this idea that this system is really handicapped for prevention. And even though they vowed to fix these problems, they made those same promises 17 years ago. And this was supposed to be the fail-safe bureaucracy, the fail-safe system, but again, open to political meddling. And part of that is not possible to address, I think, without addressing some of the bottlenecks in the flow of information and public accountability in China. Now, the other thing I think that needs to be really considered is that how China has used its COVID-19 response as an avenue for domestic repression. And this in particular, looking at the central government's liaison office in Hong Kong using COVID-19 as an excuse to declare full authority over Hong Kong, and to make high-profile arrests of pro-democracy activists. And I guess what I wanted to point out here is that if we think about global leadership, it's not just an inherent attribute. Leadership is relational. the very nature of leadership is that you have to have followers. And if we think about China's response to COVID-19, we have to think about, well, if we're going to make projections about China as a global leader, we have to ask the question of who are the followers that might be part of that. And I think that at the moment it's providing a great example for authoritarian states, but beyond that, it needs to be the examples of domestic repression in Hong Kong. There's also examples of that in Xinjiang. I think undercuts the appeal beyond the club of authoritarian states. And so there's other points I could raise about China's relations with Africa and some of the tensions that have risen as a part of its COVID-19 response. But I guess the main point is that we need to look at this as a sort of multi-dimensional and saying that in some respects we see China's position like that the abysmal response by the US has comparatively made China seem like a good model, but the Chinese system does have lots of different problems within it that make it such that this idea of this Chinese ascendance on the back of global 19 should be really questioned.
Thanks, Sarah. Andrew, what's your view on China's position in the world and the impact of COVID-19?
Yeah, I think we're starting from a general observation that the pandemic has not changed the course of history in terms of evolving Sino-US relations, but I think it has accelerated the pace of history. And what I mean by that is that the United States-China relationship, it is, a cliche though it is true, it is the world's most important diplomatic relationship, and it has been souring for at least a decade as China has increasingly adopted a more assertive posture within the region, particularly but not exclusively with regards to the South China Sea, and the United States in the meantime has vowed to engage in a pivot to the Pacific. What I find really interesting and disturbing if we look at the way that the geopolitics, the traditional interstate rivalries are playing out in the region, is that history hasn't stopped as the pandemic catastrophe has unfolded. To give simply one illustration of this, the USS Theodore Roosevelt, United States aircraft carrier in which their crew were struck down with coronavirus, has been temporarily moved from part of the region. What that has in turn allowed is an increase in China's direct military assertiveness in the South China Sea within the last month. So it's an indication of the fact that when a power vacuum opens up, that China will seek to expand its long-standing but increasingly vigorously asserted territorial claims. I think the second thing that it reinforces is what I describe as the problematic centrality of China within the current international system. I think, as Sarah has illustrated, if we look at this as a global governance challenge, and this echoes some of what Shaha's been saying as well, there is no solution to the COVID-19 crisis or any other global governance crisis without the direct engagement and involvement of China. But if we look at, for example, the way that the Australia-China relationship has played out in the last couple of weeks, it is very evident that China is increasingly willing to weaponise economic interdependence in order to very publicly communicate its displeasure in situations where economic clients of China are getting out of line. And I think what that's likely to do is if you combine the combination of accelerating and intensifying Sino-US estrangement at a grand strategic level, with an increasing awareness within the region of the downside as well as the upside of economic engagement with China, I think it probably illustrates the fact that we are heading for some extraordinarily dark times ahead in terms of the larger strategic dynamics within the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that makes this so fascinating for political watchers is, as you say, we can watch all this movement on the international level, but as nearly all of you have alluded, there is this fluidity between domestic politics and international politics in relation to COVID-19. And another question that I've found really interesting is that political watchers, when we watch the response to this pandemic, we get to see different types of political system responding to that pandemic. And I wonder, Shahar, if you can flesh out a little bit more some of the differences in responses we see between authoritarian states and democracies, for example.
My own view, thanks Sarah, my own view is that to frame the question in terms of democracy versus authoritarianism is not exactly the right lens. In my view, probably the best way to look at it would be the difference between the responses of states that have retained a meaningful capacity to mobilize resources and people towards the kinds of intervention that are required to handle this crisis and those that have not. So, for instance, we see very different kinds of countries, like, for instance, Korea or Israel, or even Australia, Germany, and others intervene very successfully, as well as, you know, albeit with far less attention to its citizens' human rights. China, again, an authoritarian state, intervene quite effectively to stem the dissemination of COVID-19. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of liberal democracies and other democracies have actually undertaken steps that, at one point at least, were seen to be incommensurate with this system of government in recent times, actually borrowing quite a bit from the Chinese playbook in this case. I'm old enough to remember 2 or 3 months ago when China implemented the lockdowns in Wuhan, people horrified around the world, but then we essentially seen very similar things happen in other countries. So I think the difference is more about countries, and the explanation for why that is quite long, and it brings back to some extent some of the earlier points that I made, why some countries have retained that capacity and others have not. I think that is the key difference. On the other hand, you see the United States and the UK, but also some other European countries that for the longest time have, for a variety of reasons, bought into the idea that the market will provide, there is no need to retain those kinds of capacities in government, now realizing that perhaps that position was mistaken.
And I suppose one of the things that's interesting then to follow on from saying, Shahar, is that what we consider to be a good political response doesn't necessarily have to do with the nature of the political system of the responder. So what does it have to do with? Sarah, what do you think a successful model of political response to pandemic looks like?
I think Shahar's exactly right. We've seen good responses or effective responses in authoritarian regimes. We've seen effective responses in democracies. And the factors that seem to make the most difference is that those are the systems that react fast, that take the danger seriously, where there's a willingness, this is particularly in democracies, a willingness to follow at some point expert advice, and where you either see in democracies a trust in government, or in more authoritarian regimes a coercive or controlling power of the state. And so there's been, each system has had been able to mobilize the sort of attributes of that system to fight the pandemic. But it's not that one has excelled over the other. I mean, personally, I think that there has been more costs in the authoritarian systems than democratic ones. But when it comes to sort of the larger patterns of repression that I had talked about before, but I think that what we're seeing is this: the successful model isn't the model of governance, it's the form that governance takes. I think Shahar wants to come in.
Yeah, come in, Shahar.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry to come back to the earlier point, but something I would have liked to mention perhaps is the case of Singapore. So Singapore is an authoritarian state. It was held up in the earlier days of the crisis as a success model. At one point, it even had everything back open again. And then cases started to spike, and now it's actually doing not so well. The reason behind that is actually the sort of hidden problem, if you like, of Singapore, foreign labor that is brought in and housed in very unpleasant condition, very poor pay. So in a sense, that facade of this efficient authoritarian or like authoritarian state that people have always imagined Singapore to be actually collapsed very quickly under the pressure of COVID-19. So that's quite an interesting case for me, because it shows that there's only so much bluffing you can do when you're dealing with a virus.
I think the other interesting thing that's been brought up about governance, there's been a lot of press about how states led by women are doing a particularly good response in relation to the pandemic. Do you think there's anything to this claim? Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, certainly analysts have pointed to female leaders in Denmark, Finland, Germany, New Zealand, Norway, Iceland, Taiwan as evidence that women are more capable of managing the crisis than their male counterparts. And some of the attributes that have been pointed to are resilience, pragmatism, the need for coalition, humility to have trust in expert advice as a feature of female leadership. But I think it's really important to look beyond individuals and look at systems and societies here. And that, that some of the broader attributes of the societies that elect women into leadership positions in the first place, they tend to have greater gender parity in society and more women in political and economic leadership roles generally. So women on, say, economic corporate boards. And there's a political culture there, and sociologists have pointed to this, a political culture where there is where societies that are more prone to elect women into leadership positions have a relative support for and trust in government. And so this just leads to the conclusion that, that we need to look sort of beyond the individual attributes of these women leaders and look at the broader societal attributes of those states and societies, and that more egalitarian and gender balanced states have been better at fighting the pandemic, and if we look beyond that, presumably better at crisis management.
Yeah, I don't know whether or not our panelists can see, but we have an extensive store of questions building up, which our audience is dying to ask you. So just quickly before we turn to those questions, I'd like to ask the three of you, starting with Andrew. Are you an optimist or a pessimist about the long-term prospects for international relations in a post-COVID world?
Well, I like to look at the dark side of things, so I'm going to put the case for pessimism, which is that at least in the short to medium term, unfortunately, if we look at this particularly from the perspective of what will the COVID crisis do for prospect of international conflict, I think there are three ways in which the COVID crisis will drive greater insecurity and greater conflict within the international system. The first of those, and I think Sarah covered this really nicely earlier, is that there is a distressing rise in xenophobia that has accompanied the COVID crisis, and it has been one that has further fueled an existing tendency towards populist extremism. Now, as Shahar flagged at the start, this is an economic crisis as much as it is a public health crisis. So I think the first one which this will fuel conflict is that it will further stoke up the rise of aggressive populists in the international system. They're the very kinds of regimes that are likely to engage in activities like diversion and war. The second and third, very briefly, because I know that we want to open it up for discussion, the tendency towards deglobalization and economic decoupling is one that is likely to continue to accelerate for the foreseeable future. The reason that that's a problem, pro-globalization scholars and commentators always overstated the pacifying effect of increasing trade and investment as a means of diminishing conflict within the international system. But it wasn't entirely exaggerated. And what we're seeing with the tendency towards what they call onshoring, bringing manufacturing home, addressing the kind of supply chain vulnerabilities that Shahar was talking about, is a corrosion of some of the bonds of economic interdependence that would have otherwise mitigated against conflict. The third and final one is, as Sarah mentioned earlier, what we're likely to see major cuts to the ability of the international system to fund things like peacekeeping throughout the world. There'll be an under-provision of collective public goods, and that is going to also create various exciting problems for us to study.
Thank you, Andrew. I just want to say, in relation to the questions, those of you who are in the audience will note that there's a very large number of questions, and you may also note that you can do what Zoom calls upvote those questions. So if there's a question that you want to see answered that's similar to one that you like, if you click that little thumbs up button, that'll signal the system to send the question up to the top. So that can help me prioritize all of these great many questions that are coming through, and they look fantastic. Because Andrew gave us a long list of reasons to be pessimistic, I'm gonna have to ask Sarah and Shahar to keep their answers about optimism and pessimism really short so we can get to our rapidly expanding stack of questions. Sarah, quickly, and then Shahar.
Oh, look, I dispositionally am an optimist, but I think that I have to agree with Andrew that there are some real concerns in the international system. All I can say is if there is cause for optimism, it's that we're seeing at the same time as these rise in xenophobia, for example, I referenced in this region, that it being counteracted with really active civil society, coming to out with innovative campaigns to talk about, I'm thinking particularly in Southeast Asia, really innovative campaigns about protecting the rights of migrants and refugees as because it relates to everyone's health. And so at the same time as there's the specific targeting of the community saying, like, we're all in this together. These sick people in our society are a risk for all of us, and we need to take care of them. And so if there's anything, I hope that there's a normative pushback, but I have to say that some of those deep fault lines and challenges I agree with Andrew on.
Okay, my questions are getting longer and longer. So Shahar, 3 words.
Very briefly, to quote Antonio Gramsci, optimism of the intellect, pessimism, the other way around, sorry. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. That is my motto. I think the intellect says pessimism, the will says optimism. I think if there is any bright spots in a crisis, it's always that it also rejuvenates politics. It opens up sometimes new opportunities that were not there before. But we know from previous crises that usually the arc of those changes is quite long. They don't happen overnight. But maybe there are things afoot as we speak that could open up some interesting and hopeful opportunities later on.
Excellent. Okay, I'm now going to turn to our expanding, pardon me, Sarah?
Sorry, so hopefully it's another nail in the coffin of the Trump administration, so that might be cause for optimism.
Well, there may be a variety of unexpected silver linings, but I'm going to turn now to our audience who are going crazy on the question in a Q&A page. I'm going to turn to one from Kwame Eshin, who's one of our students here at UQ, and he asks, will the coronavirus crisis shake the international balance of power? So post-COVID, are we going to see a decline in US power and a rise in China's power? Who wants to tackle that from the panel?
Andrew?
Yeah, I think one of the things that it will do, and I think this is regardless of who wins the presidency in November, is that we are likely to see a more introspective United States, a United States that will turn inwards to try to address some of the deep social divisions and governance problems that have been dramatised by the COVID crisis. And given the oversized role the United States has played in the international system as a collective security provider to date, that will open up opportunities for revisionist actors that do seek to challenge that order at the margins.
So we have another interesting question here from Cordelia Henderson, who wants to know opinions on Australia having a prominent lead on this question of the international investigation to the origins of COVID-19 in China. Do we think this is a good thing or a bad thing? Sarah or Shahar, do you guys want Shahar?
Yeah, I think that if we step away for a second from the Murdoch press and we look at what actually happened in the lead up to the situation, I actually think that the way that a lot of this has been interpreted is somewhat mistaken. The Australian government has put itself in front in demanding this investigation, in a sense attracting a fairly hefty price for that. We can see that through the tariffs on Australian grown barley and also beef exports, where ultimately the EU ended up putting together a proposal that Australia joined and that in the end seems to be almost sailing through the WHA process, even with Chinese support, funny enough. So if you ask me whether it was a smart thing to do to go ahead with it, I think that it wasn't. I think that it would have been smarter to try and construct coalitions in the first place and then go ahead with those coalitions. There are some commentators in Australia that have developed the view that if we're annoying China, we must be doing something right. Well, I don't think that that is how you run foreign policy. I think that you need to act a bit more, a bit smarter and try and maximize the opportunities to build coalitions first.
So we have another interesting question, this one from an anonymous attendee, which is, what are your thoughts, panel, on whether or not the coronavirus has exposed the weaknesses of neoliberalism? And if so, how?
Well, I take it it's
go for it.
It relates to my previous. I think neoliberalism is arguably dead. It's been pronounced dead before, but I do think that this time it seems very difficult to imagine a return to the status quo ante after this crisis, given the scale of public spending, given the scale of state intervention, sure, we've seen something along those lines happen before, after the global financial crisis, but the scale now is so much bigger and the economic decline is so steep that in order to reverse these public spending programs in the foreseeable future would require essentially accepting social disorder and potentially the kinds of scenes on the streets of our countries that I don't think anyone would like to see. At the same time, there is a kind of corporatist element here where governments would like to support industries in order to not allow them to collapse due to decline in demand. So there are a range of interests here that suggest to me that public spending is not going to be wound back in the near term. It might take longer. And at that point, I think that there's not going to be the kind of ideological consensus that we had in the past around neoliberal policies. That is my prediction at this point.
Sarah, Andrew, either of you want to weigh in on that one? Are we happy to move to the next one? Well, I have an interesting question here, and I am starting to slightly amalgamate these questions just in the interest of time and getting as many answered as possible. It's a very interesting question here from Kanar on the question of regional integration and alliances and how well they work in relation to COVID-19. So Kanar says, when COVID-19 hit Europe, France and Germany didn't respond to Italy's urgent need and demands for medical supplies. So do we think we're going to see nationalist behavior which is going to impact international relations? And can countries trust each other post-COVID-19? Andrew, do you want to have a stab at that one?
Happy to jump in there. I'm really beginning to realise that I'm putting out a very pessimistic vibe. But again, I think in the short term, I think one of the issues that is playing out, particularly in the European context, is that to a degree, yes, there has been some cooperation, but as a distant observer, what has struck me more has been some of the pathologies that have manifested in the European Union as a result of this crisis. And I think if we think of, and it relates to what Shah was saying, there is a huge amount of government debt that is being accumulated in a fairly differential pattern at the moment in the European Union. What I suspect it is going to do is to further exacerbate a lot of the distributional challenges that the European Union dealt with in the aftermath of the Eurozone crisis. So in the European context, I'm relatively pessimistic. Where I think will be particularly interesting is observing in the East Asian context whether some of the knock-on effects of a rising resurgent China might potentially have some centripetal effect on alliance partnerships in the region as they try to address that as a challenge.
I think a natural follow-up that's coming up repeatedly in my Q&A list here is the relationship with Australia's trading patterns in the pandemic. So what are the panel's views on whether or not, because of the pandemic, Australia might wish to reconsider its trading partnerships? And if so, how would they go about doing that? Is it even possible?
Would you like me to take that, Sarah?
Sure.
Look, people have been talking about diversification for quite a long time. If it was that easy to do, it would have happened by now. The truth is it's not. It's very hard to find a replacement, especially for Chinese demand for the kinds of raw commodities and even international education that Australia actually sells in the world. I think that it's very hard to find a replacement, and I don't think that anyone has a clear idea how to go about doing that. The other issue is that Australia, a lot of the things that people buy in Australia are also manufactured through global value chains, going back to what I said before. Even though, for instance, food is grown in Australia, the jars that they put it in are not made here. The tins that they put it in are not, I mean, all of these things, to unravel that is incredibly difficult. And that is what Australian trade looks like. So I think in order to do that, we are going to need, and maybe that's coming because I think that, like I said before, economic thinking could be shifting. But we're going to need to do things in this country that we haven't done in decades, like economic planning, like industrial policy. We're going to have to do active things in order to shift these patterns. Otherwise, these things are not going to happen all on their own. We're just going to continue to do what we've done for a while.
Interesting. Oh, Sarah, did you want to come in there? Sorry.
I was just going to raise the point that I think that one area that there might sort of be a flow-on effect is on pharmaceuticals and PPE, in that China supplies the vast majority of global pharmaceuticals, and we've seen some bottlenecks there. And I think that there has been talk, not just in Australia, but the US and other countries, about saying that this is going to be thinking of this as a national security issue, and thinking about either the stockpiling of some of these if they can, but also just saying that PPE and pharmaceuticals, there needs to be a diversification in the least of supplies, but potentially domestic manufacturing of some of them. Shahar well and truly points to the problems of that, or the challenges to that. But I think that we've seen countries mobilize around national security issues before. Once it's deemed a threat, that they find a way to throw resources at it. And so I think that may be an area where we see countries investing more in.
Thanks, Sarah. I think one of the other more common questions which is coming up in the Q&A, there's a series of questions relating to the impact of COVID-19 on inequality, both within states and internationally. I wonder if any of the panelists would like to discuss what they think that relationship is going to look like, and what, if anything, can be done about it. Andrew?
Would you like me to
I think Andrew had his hand up, Shahar, and then we'll go to you after.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think that it's dramatized is that, and I think this is particularly the case with the extraordinarily distressing fatalities in the United States, the scale of that human tragedy that is playing out there, is that what I think it has illustrated is the national security vulnerabilities that flow from pervasive economic inequality and an under-provision of public goods. What I think is, and again, I think to try to introduce a discordant note of optimism into what has been a fairly grim discussion so far. And it speaks to the issue that Shahar mentioned earlier in terms of the political possibilities that can come from crisis. What I would like to think is that if we have learned anything from this crisis, it's that societies, particularly in the face of a challenge like a pandemic, are as secure as their most vulnerable citizens. And I think if we try to play that out in terms of what that might look like in terms of political solutions, that's something that actually makes me slightly more hopeful. The problem of inequality and accelerating inequality has been there at least the past 40 years, but potentially the pandemic might dramatize the costs that arise from rampant inequality and enable us to do something about it.
Well, we have come to the end of our time, so we've hit 6 o'clock, which is very disappointing because I know there are a lot of questions out there and we haven't had a chance to answer them all. And I want to actually have an opportunity to say, if you are watching this webinar and you think these questions are really interesting, this is actually what we try and do in our seminars that we run here as part of our postgraduate programs, in particular in international relations, in peace and conflict studies, and in governance and public policy. So one of the reasons why we were keen to do this seminar is it showcases the talents of our academic staff in being extraordinarily informed observers of real world problems. And this is the kind of stuff that we bring into the classroom. So if you are a prospective student and you're interested in master's study, please do get in touch with us. The easiest way to do that is via the Pulsis webpage. If you Google Pulsis UQ, that will come up. I am so sorry we didn't get a chance to get to all of those questions. I hope I managed to cover a broad base of them. And I just want to thank you all for joining us, and also to thank our 4 panelists for really, really terrific discussion. Thank you so much. In an ordinary world, we would be mingling afterwards and having a conversation, and unfortunately that's really difficult to do in this virtual world. But please go ahead and have a virtual mingle with each other, and maybe have a nice glass of wine or a glass of sparkling water at home and pretend you're at a cocktail party. Thank you so much for coming. And yes, thanks a lot. That's it for us. Thank you. Bye-bye.